been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Like many of you out there, I have a dread fascination with the Kriegsmesser, or war knife. I now have my hands on a sparring safe Kriegsmesser made by VB Sword Shop, sold through Purple Heart Armory. And we already use a lot of their swords. We have a ton of their long swords and other swords here, so I knew that they were gonna be a trusted name to try a safe sparring implement out, and now I have one. I'm very excited to use this. My objectives for this review is to decide if this version of a Sparring Kriegsmesser is worth the buy. I think at the time of purchase, this was in the mid to high 300s, and the only other company that makes a Sparring Kriegsmesser that I know of, or that's well known, is Siggy, which theirs is a lot more expensive, I think closer to the 550, and then you have shipping after that. I also want to see how one may plausibly fight with a weapon like this, because currently everybody kind of believes that you just use longsword techniques with this, and I think that some of that might be true, but I just have a feeling there's more to it than that, and I want to explore, I want to go into the nuances of how this sword may be used. Maybe this sword is a lot easier to use, maybe there's a lot less going on with it than a longsword, and maybe there's not, maybe there's more. I think the only way to figure this out with such a lack of documentation is to just try it out and see what we think. So in this review, I'm gonna spar and have other students spar with the sword, and we're gonna give our opinions, and by the end of it, I'm gonna tell you whether this is worth your money and how you might be more successful using this sword against, say, a longsword. This sword was used by professional soldiers in the late medieval period in around the German territories. It is a larger version of the Langmesser, or long knife. It is constructed in a very similar way, where we have a knife-style hilt with two wood slabs with the tang sometimes exposed, a quillon guard very similar to a longsword or arming sword, and usually a single-edged blade that is fine-tuned for cutting, but it can be a slightly curved edge or a straight edge. Now, unlike long swords, there isn't anything out there on how to fight with a Kriegsmesser. The best we can go off of is artwork and very sparse text from historical documents. The longsword and the Kriegsmesser were contemporaries, though. They did exist and they were used at roughly the same time, but they became phased out during the Renaissance era for smaller swords with more complex hilts. Like everybody else, I have a fascination with how this sword may have been used, because there's a big mystery behind it. I kind of want to just figure it out through sparring and through reading. And luckily, I have a real Kriegsmesser to compare this one to, and maybe we can come down to some understanding of how this sword may have been used by comparing these two together. This is a Pavelmach Kriegsmesser that was commissioned by my girlfriend for our 1-year anniversary, and it is one of my favorite swords in my collection. If you haven't seen the video of our review on this, check it out right here. Now, I did have this sword customized because it doesn't have a very heavy tip on it. I actually had it shaved down a bit in shape, and that makes it a lot more agile than what I think most Kriegsmessers probably felt like. It's less choppy, it's more tip controllable, it's very fun to swing around, and it weighs a little bit more than the Sparring Kriegsmesser that we got. The VB Kriegsmesser also feels very controllable in the hands, but because this tip is a little bit stouter, I would say, it definitely has more of a, it's like it wants to carry through the target. It doesn't want to stop as easily when you're throwing those cuts. It wants to just go through. And so a sword like this feels like, in my opinion, just throwing it around now, it feels like a sword that's going to be a more heavy cutter. Heavy cutter, less point oriented, which makes sense because this is a curved blade, and it is rather wide. The Sharp Pavelmach, which is on top, and the blunt VB on the bottom, seem to be modeled after the same sized Kriegsmesser. From the pommel all the way down to the tip, they are. If you notice that the tips of the swords are very close in length, and if we go all the way down to which are a little bit longer on the Pavelmach and a little shorter on the VB. Something that I would say would be a good improvement on the VB Kriegsmesser would be to elongate these quillons to the length of the Pavelmach quillons up top. I think that these quillons are a little short and don't protect the hands as much as they could. Weighing the Kriegsmessers together, the VB comes out to 2 pounds and 12 ounces, while the Purple Heart Kriegsmesser comes out to 3 pounds and 4 ounces. I find the weight findings on this very interesting because while they feel very similar to each other, this does feel more tip heavy than the Purple Heart Kriegsmesser, which flows very well even one-handed. I can feel a bit more of a drag with the VB Sparring Kriegsmesser. This one, I don't know, it just feels a lot more lively, and that might be because there's more weight in the pommel. So if we take a look at that pommel size, this has way more material on it than this does, and that's going to counteract some of this weight. That being said, this does weigh a solid pound less than this does. My initial impressions of the VB Kriegsmesser is overall good. I do find that it is slightly more tip heavy than my live steel version, but I find that it is still very manageable and it looks amazing. It is exactly what I think a Kriegsmesser would feel like in a sparring form. Overall construction feels robust and nothing rattled out of the box. I think if VB included longer quillons on their next model, it would help to protect the hands a lot more, but I won't know until I spar with the sword. Check out part 2 of this episode to see how this sword fares in heavy sparring. I got nothing else for you guys. Bye.